Welcome. Today is Thursday, September 10th. This is Problem Solving in Turbulence with Dialectic Simulations. My name is Timothy Clancy. I'm the founder and CEO of Dialectic Simulations. I am joined today by my colleague and friend, Rafat Zaini. Rafat is a research scientist at WPI, and he's an expert modeler of dynamic systems ranging from things like organizational design, dissent, change, strategy, cognitive learning. He's got 20 years of experience in the industry, both in research at MIT, consulting groups like the Advanced Management. He has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in aeronautical and industrial engineering, and a PhD in system dynamics focusing on organizational behavior. Because of all that, we've invited him to talk about COVID-19, which has nothing to do with anything I just listed, but he's a really good simulation modeler, and he's built a simulation of COVID-19 that we wanted to use today to walk through and discuss some concepts that we talk about a lot here in systems thinking. But I'm going to include, if you're watching this on the YouTube, in the comments below is going to be a link to his LinkedIn if you want to check him out and say hi. We really appreciate his time today. So welcome, Rafat. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tim, for having me. Thank you to all the viewers who joined us, and I hope you have a good time with us today. I will have a good time.
We're definitely going to have a good time. So what we wanted to do today is, since we have Rafat here and he's done some simulation models, is to kind of let him take on the job of some of the discussion. I'll be a facilitator host, relaying your questions from the feed as well as some questions I've got. And what we're going to do is we're going to use COVID-19 as an illustrative example for some of the things that we often run into with structured systems thinking, things like system structure, dynamic behavior, simulation models, stocks and flows, feedback loops. We're going to go through those in segments, and we're going to tie it to COVID-19 because, of course, everyone's talking about COVID-19. Everyone's familiar with it. They different levels of knowledge, sure, but we all experience it. And a lot of this is just representative of what these tools can use in other areas, business, government, nonprofit, things like that. So with that, Rafat, I'll turn it over to you if you want to go ahead and kick us off with what are some of the dynamic behaviors with COVID-19 we're seeing? You know, we get all this data. How do you, as a system dynamicist and modeler, look at that data and interpret that data? If you want to start off there.
Well, thank you, Tim. That's a great question. And if you allow me, I'd like to share a small cartoon on my screen to talk about this. So if I'm allowed, I'll
go ahead.
The screen, and you can let me know if you are seeing my screen. Do you see my screen?
I see your screen, and I think everyone on Facebook should see your screen too. If you aren't seeing it on the live feed, let us know, but it'll be delayed, so it won't matter anyways. Go ahead.
Yeah, so if you look at this cartoon and see that gentleman sitting surrounded with so many charts, I mean, that's probably an office that looks from the past, but these data charts like pop up from your phone, from your tablet, or from your laptop or your desktop or newspaper, whatever. We're surrounded with all this. And if you see that boss, he's looking to his employee and asking him, hey, we've got all the data. What's the holdup? He's asking for insights, something to work with, something to build upon. And with all this data surrounding us, we need to know what to do about them. We need to know why they behave the way they do. We need to go deeper in order to be able to use them. Otherwise, they will just be stored on fancy charts that we will be bombarded every day.
And that's certainly the case with COVID. I think all of us have been that person in that room when it comes to COVID, where we're surrounded by data just coming at us in different charts and graphs.
Exactly. So if I see this going further a bit about the dynamic behavior, a dynamic behavior is a phenomena that changes over time. So whenever we hear the word dynamic, there's something about change, and it changes over time. And I'm bringing some of the things that you probably seeing every day, such charts, like, for example, you see in the x-axis, you see time, you see March 20, June, and on the y-axis, which I'm pointing to, is the COVID cases that we all have seen all over these
So
days.
What's the phenomena on that chart? What is this phenomena that this chart's tracking?
This chart is tracking the cases per day. So this means on this day, the number of cases that were reported. So as you progress in time, you see that chart, for example, of Italy is growing. The chart of Peru is growing, but it comes a bit later. So that's what we are looking at.
Great.
You can also see another chart that looks like this. Again, time in the x-axis. Here is also reported cases on the y-axis. That's another way of displaying this, this data. And we talk about, or we hear about words like exponential growth, reaching the peak, declining cases, flattening the curve, second wave.
That's my favorite. I'm a big advocate of the double hump or the second wave or the wave 1.5. I've talked a lot about those.
Yeah, so when we hear those, they represent what's happening on such curves. For example, growth. We call a curve is growing when we see that it's coming up as the time progresses. We can also talk about decline when we see the curve going down over time. And we can also see oscillations when we look to curves like this, something going up and down, and then overall it's growing or declining here. So we're looking at localized behavior, and we're looking at behavior that extends for a longer range of time. So that's about the dynamic behavior. Now to tie it to a story that we are living currently that Tim introduced about COVID-19. And let's start from the beginning. We have a case that was discovered that is infectious. So if you can see down in the bottom right, you see this diagram. I'm showing number one, and this is time. So we're showing a dynamic behavior. There's the day number one, there's nothing happening. Over time, more cases are coming from different locations, which increases the number of infectious population. People would say probably infected. Infectious means they're capable of infecting others. So the number grows from 1 to 10. And how did this grow? You see this pipe and box, we call this a flow, and it's a pipe that is.
So is this the simulation itself you're showing?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the structure of the pandemic that we're looking at. You're basically breaking this up into structural pieces. Could you talk a little bit about the structure here that's driving this?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about now. And this is we call a stock, where like a container that contains these numbers. So what's happening as we go along? These cases can stay as they are. However, those people live in a community, and those people in the community makes them susceptible to infection. That's why we have this other box, which is called a susceptible population, those who can be infected. As long as those folks are separated, they're not connected, there's nothing happening. However, if there is a connection between them, they mix with each other, there's something that happens, which is infection. Those folks start infecting those folks in that box. And this is what we call a contagion loop. Those people who are in the infectious population, through infection rate, they bring people from this box and make them infectious. And that's when we see that this curve is growing, which could become an exponential growth.
And we've seen that growth in so this is basically walking through the structure of a pandemic as it hits a community, a state, a country. It could be at any scale. I mean, you've picked out some numbers, but it shows that growth curve going up that you showed on the behavior chart, that dynamic growth curve, correct?
Yes, exactly. So we call it, so the more infectious people, the more there are people infected, and we call this a reinforcing loop.
Yep.
I'm sorry about that. I think we can do this with editing.
Keep going.
Okay. So, however, I should probably retract. This exponential growth, the question comes, would it grow forever? And my answer to this is probably not. It will reach a stage, what we call of equilibrium. And why this is happening? It's because if we have a limited population, And the more they become infected, the less the number of people who are susceptible to become infected. And we call this a balancing loop that doesn't keep this going all over. It kind of puts a limit to it, and it doesn't grow forever.
Mm-hmm.
Is that clear?
Yeah. What is this model, this kind of model called? Is this a specific type of model? Is this one you just created? Is this a standard model for pandemics?
Yeah, this is the, I'll answer this question in a few seconds. So
okay.
if I continue my...
Continue.
Yeah, I'm still like pushing forward. However, what's happening over time also, that people who are infected, they will be either recover or they'll either die, and they will be drained from this particular box to become a removed population or probably recovered. And that's what causes a decline. So if you remember, the blue curve before was constant, doesn't change. Now it starts to decline because people will be either die or they will hopefully recover. And if we see this, we see the susceptible, the infection, the infectious, and the removed or recovered. That's a famous model in epidemiology called the SIR model. The SIR model is susceptible, infectious, recovered population.
So this model, so let's pause here for a few questions. This model is not built just for COVID. This is a model of any generic pandemic or virus or thing that acts in that way, correct?
Exactly, yes.
It looks very simple. If you were using, like if you were at the CDC and trying to plan US responses, or you were the head of a major corporation, would you use a model this simple, or would you use a more complex model if you were making policy decisions?
That's a very good question. So use of models is really depending also on the timing of the use, you know? So if at an early stage of a pandemic or so, a simple model would suffice, because you're basically, there's very limited space to react. First of all, for example, this would simulate like a country borders. They have cases flowing into a country or in a town. So that could help in, okay, to limit this phenomena from growing, I need to stop what is coming in. So this could be allowed for a major policy at a very high level. Okay, so we just contain it. But the next comes, you know, when you think about venues, when you think about age groups, et cetera, et cetera. So this same simple model can go into much detail.
Are there different names for these types of models, the simple and the detailed one? Are there different classes of simulations that people would run into?
Oh yeah, for example, what we call, this is the SIR model. That's the simplest version. I don't think there is a simpler version than this one. However, it depicts the phenomena that these curves are generated with. But for example, there is a more detailed one which has the exposed section. So between the susceptible and infectious, there are people who are exposed, but they never get infected. So there is the SEIR model, which is the susceptible, exposed, infected, and removed. And then there are other details that, as I mentioned before, that can go into age groups, in locations.
So this one here is more for exploration and understanding at a high level.
Exactly, because you can also track people going into hospitals, people going into critical care, and then end up at the end. So these positions or these boxes here don't change, but there are probably boxes in the middle that tracks other things. Because if you are just deciding to control a pandemic, it's different from if you are using the model to design for the capacity of hospitals and healthcare infrastructure. This one is just telling us what is happening when something like this starts and what we can do at the beginning, but it is not like a detailed planning model.
So this is showing more the dynamic behavior in general but you might use a more sophisticated model if you said, okay, from that, we want to plan something specifically for this hospital, this city, this area.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But it is, in the overall, it is the same structure.
Yep. And we've got questions here from the feed. Could equilibrium not be reached if the virus keeps mutating and thus reinfecting people, and/or no immunity develops within an infected person? So Ms. Falkenberry is asking, i.e., what happens if the removed population loops back to the infectious and/or susceptible?
That's a great question. Yes. So, for example,
do we want to cover that later?
As you wish. Yeah, we will talk about it later. So
okay, so let's do that. I think what we might be able to do, Ms. Falkenberry, if you're willing to wait, we can actually maybe show that and discuss it live and show what happens if we create a loop from the removed back to the susceptible. But I want to put that to later, and then maybe do that at towards the end where we can go in and maybe create some live structure. So
sure.
You know, this model was not built with that in mind. This model doesn't have that currently, correct?
It doesn't have it. No.
Okay, so we can try adding it and see what happens. So great. Other questions that people have on this particular mod, this view? I'll just do a quick check. So this, before we move on, this is a generic system structure of a pandemic viral outbreak, and it could be used for COVID-19, it could be used for smallpox, it could be used for flu. It's going to show the same behaviors, but the numbers and the curves and all that detail will change based on how much you put into the simulation, if you have a more detailed simulation, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Exactly. Well, let's go in and break it down a little more. What's going on inside this? How are these models built, if you want to continue?
Sure. So I want to tie this to what we started with at the beginning about dynamic behavior. So this dynamic behavior that we demonstrated is generated from what we call 3 feedback loops. And what they are, I mean, I'll explain it. This growth part that we can see at the beginning is generated from what we call a reinforcing loop, an increase in infection by infecting susceptibles. That's why we get this leg of growth. However, as we also talked, there is a limit to growing this infection if we depleted the susceptible population. And this brings that top point here, is that we can't grow beyond that. And as people are removed from this population of infectious, which we call it also a balancing loop, then we get this part of a decline. So there are 3 loops creating the system structure that generates the behavior that we see. And that's what leads us to say is that behavior results from a structure. You can link what you see to each loop that is acting. So that's a brief introduction to a dynamic behavior, how it is linked to a structure.
So in summary, dynamic behavior is driven by the feedback structure.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. That's a good summary. And as I said, in a nutshell, this is a susceptible, infected, removed SIR model. It's not my model. I did not invent it. I used literature. This is Sterman 2000 book. It's a business dynamics and systems thinking book. I don't get the title probably right. And we do have a link to this model people can also experiment with, which we will do shortly probably.
So quick question, on these models, you have 10,000 people, so it's a small community, it represents a small population. They always are being drained 100%, 100% are getting infected. Is that realistic? That everyone gets infected in this model?
No, but this model assumes perfect mixing, that, all those people here together, they are the same. They're not different. I'm not differentiating between people sitting in their homes and never leave, or people in the same town, living in the countryside and they don't mix. We're assuming like those people will go out and mix together. And this is good, for example, if you happen to think about something that is happening in a very small community where people live with each other and they're infected with somebody who's going there, that could be a perfect.
So like an elderly care facility where everyone's together and we've seen those high infections, that may represent higher mixing?
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Okay. And as we will say, that represents a very high contact rate, where people are together and they see each other, and then they see each other not only once during the day, they probably see each other multiple times during the day, etc., etc. But yeah, we are assuming here like people would be mixed together perfectly. Just for simplicity, it doesn't really change how the curve look like. It just probably changes the timing, it changes the peak height, but the growth and decline, it's the same.
So you have a couple different growth and declines on the bottom right there. Are we going to get into those later?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's right. But
Go
if
ahead.
we want to go deeper and understand, because I threw to you the word stocks, the words flow, and I owe you an explanation for what that means.
Please.
So there are two key systems thinking concepts when we talk about dynamic behavior, the stocks and flows and the feedback loops. We already talked quickly about feedback loops that I showed, and also stocks and flow, but I'll go deeper now. And let's start with the stocks and flows. And if you recall, we have seen this box and these two pipes. A pipe that goes into the box is called an inflow, and the pipe that goes out, it's an outflow, which is, if we think about famous analogy, the bathtub, let's assume the stock is the bathtub, the inflow is the flow of water in, and the outflow is draining or emptying, that attempts to empty the bathtub. That's the basic concept of stocks and flows.
But that's an abstraction of what's going on. Is there a mathematical basis behind these stocks and flows? Is there some sort of mathematics that's happening here?
Yes, there is mathematics. I won't go deeper in this, but I'll explain what are the implications of that.
Great.
So to do some math, if the inflow is equal to the outflow, the water flowing in is equal to the amount of water flowing out, I will demonstrate that by putting that the inflow and the outflow are equal. That's why these two curves coincide. What's going to happen? What do we expect to happen at the stock? Will it increase or decrease or stay the same? Oops. It will stay the same, because what is in is what is out. So the level of the stock, or the level of the water in the tub, will not change. If we have more water going inside in the tub, more than the water flowing outside, as I demonstrated here, inflow is the blue, which is higher than outflow is red. Of course, you guessed it. Then the stock is increasing. It's not decreasing. So if you want to get a nice bath, you want this to happen. I mean, if you have a leaky
if you have a leaky tub, you're going to have a hard time getting your inflow up high enough.
Yeah, exactly. So don't try this at home. The third option is if the inflow is less than the outflow. This means I have less water coming in, or I have less cases coming in, but I have more cases recovering in that case. So the outflow is higher than the inflow. Yeah, of course, the stock level is declining. So this means this is somehow that we showed that the curve for the cases does not continue to grow forever, because over time people are recovering, and it depends how fast they recover. That curve will decline over time. Mathematically speaking, what's happening, this is called an integral equation, where the level at time t, which is the current time, is a function of the level at the time step before that happened in the past, plus how much is in minus the out multiplied by the time step, how quick we monitor this level of.
So let me make sure I'm following along here, and hopefully to help the people at home too. What this is saying is, if the stock T was the total COVID cases, the cumulative current cases, that would be equal to the current cases yesterday plus the new cases today minus the recovered or deceased cases today multiplied by the day, effectively at the time, and then each day it would make that change, and that would be how we track our current caseload at any point in time.
Exactly, perfect. And you
Okay.
can do this in an Excel sheet if you have it.
This is as far as I get into calculus. That's the limit right there.
You got it.
All right. So there is math here going on, and all these charts we see. So if we were to look at these charts, we see charts like daily new cases, total cases, recovered cases. They're really showing different parts of the bathtub. If we could assemble them together, we'd see daily new cases are inflow, the total cases is that level of the bathtub, and then the recovered is what's coming out of the bathtub at any point in time.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
That's a great summary. Thank you. So we're done talking about stocks and flows. We need to give examples. So stocks and flows, they can exist not only in the physical space, like cases that you can measure, you can touch. They can also be, for example, in body weight. You know, you gain body weight and you lose body weight. That's gaining is an inflow, losing weight is an outflow. It can also happen to anger. We're building anger if there are events that makes you angry. And, you know, how do you cope with anger? What do you do to vent? That's the venting. That's
I have some venting practices. I've got some venting later to do today, not because of this, but other things. So I've had some inflow of anger earlier because of some work issues. I've got some venting afterwards. But you're saying that this can deal with emotion?
Of course, anger is an emotion.
Well, no, but I mean the stocks and flows, the system dynamics can deal with very qualitative things, not just things that are easy to measure.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Interesting.
No, I mean, thank you for the example. Like you can reflect on your emotion. If you're feeling angry, you would think, what is making me feel angry? What is building my anger? So you can, oh, my inflow of events that is happening is just overwhelming me. It's not the end of it, because I can have coping techniques, and the balance between the two kind of keep that level in check.
So for example, when I post a video on COVID-19 for Sweden, there's a building anger in the Swedes. They then have anger that they then vent by posting comments on my YouTube feed. That's an example of how this would work.
You can look at it from this side as well. And if we talk about, for example, the environment, the water in the ocean resides in the stock. If it evaporates, it goes into the cloud. And that's a stock.
My notes for this says that these stocks can act as memories. Can you describe what a system memory is, how a stock is a memory?
A stock is a memory because it doesn't drain quickly. It retains that element, so it doesn't change quickly. That's how I interpret memory. It's like the body weight. Body weight, you can't reduce it today instantly.
Are you saying my body weight is a memory of all the eating choices I've made in the past, minus my exercise?
I think so.
My body weight is a bad memory. But like, so let's talk about COVID. So basically, this memory concept, is the current COVID cases a reflection of everything that's been done or not done up to that point in time? It's sort of a memory of past actions.
You mean
all the cases that have come in and why they might have come in, minus all the cases that have been recovered and why they might be recovered. The current level is sort of a memory of that.
Yeah, probably. If it's the thing is about if I can think about the physical phenomena, the physics of this, is this a memory or if we yeah, let me reflect on this. Yeah, well, you can look at it this way, because it doesn't just go. Mm-hmm. But if you think what created those cases, that's probably what makes the susceptible more susceptible, or yep. to become that. So if it is linked, for example, to body weight or something, then if, for example,
like a pre-existing condition or something, exactly. One of these pre-existing conditions they talk about.
Exactly. That would be, I would feel comfortable to say that. Yes.
Okay, great.
So can we move on?
Yep.
Do you have any questions or?
I'm tracking them on the Facebook. I got a couple here I'm going to hold for the live model, but I'm tracking it. By the way, for everyone online, if you want to ask questions, feel free to shoot them in anytime and I'll slot them in. But go ahead, Rafat, to the next section.
Okay, now the second part, which we also touched upon, the feedback loops, because we just didn't describe them properly as needed. There are positive feedback loops, which we just touched upon, which we call them the reinforcing. Mm-hmm. This is, and you see a plus sign. A plus sign is an indication of positive, where an action creates a result that influences more of the same action. And I know I probably better explain it over a diagram, which means if A increases, B increases, and if B increases, A increases. It's like an escalation.
Mm-hmm. Or compounding growth.
Or compounding growth. You have better examples, Tim, so help me out. So an increase in the variable leads to an increase in the linked variable, and we saw that the infectious people infecting others, and then infected increases the infectious, and more infectious infecting others.
So in a COVID case, one of the dangers here is we have communities that haven't had many infections, and they may think, well, we just got 10. What's the big deal? Or now we've got 25. Well, now we've got 100. And you're saying this compounding growth means that can be deceptive. Low numbers very early on can really begin increasing them dramatically.
Exactly. So small numbers is a blessing, but we shouldn't wait for an increase because it could escalate very quickly, because it's a part of a reinforcing loop. It's not just adding cases, it's multiplication. So it can explode very quickly. Okay. And that's counterintuitive to how we typically think about things. And that's where the danger is. Mm-hmm. The second type of loops is a negative feedback loop, or we call it, another naming is a balancing feedback loop, where an action that attempts to achieve a goal, to close a gap, like if I also, I mean, I'm good at explaining things with diagrams, not with words. If I see an increase in one variable actually leads to a reduction in another variable, as we have seen. As we have more people infected, we have less people susceptible to infection because they're already drained. And that kicks the balancing feedback loop, because this cannot grow forever. It's actually reducing because I'm reaching a target of 0. As I infect more people, their numbers decrease, and then I reach somehow a goal that is the end of that draining of.
So you've covered 2 feedback loops. Are there any other kind of feedback loops?
I'll give the example. Maybe if I talk about the examples, then sure, we can see how they can look like. Let me give the example of the
fish,
from the fish populations. As we have more fish, we have more birth or recruitments, they call it in the literature sometime, and this could apply in different contexts. This is a positive feedback loop, and it has a growth behavior. So we can link a growth behavior to a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is death. I mean, as we have more fish, we have more death, and we have more death, we have less number of fish. And that's a negative feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And that results in a decline. Now, the other one would be if we combine them together. And, the simplest combination is just to put, that is easy to illustrate, is a reinforcing and a balancing. So fish grows with birth or recruitment, and they decline with death. And that is a combined feedback loop. Now, the behavior that results from this is not as straightforward as this one, that, hey, positive feedback loop growth, negative feedback loop decline. It depends. If the positive feedback loop is greater than the negative feedback loop, we have growth. If they are equal, we have equilibrium, means death is equal to birth. We have equilibrium. If we have more death than recruitment or birth, then we have a resulting decline in the behavior. Does that answer your question about if there is other feedback loops, Tim?
So, yeah, so there's two kinds of feedback loops, but you can combine them into different combinations. How is there a limit on how many? Could you get 5 or 6 feedback loops all combined together?
They can be, it can be combined. So I don't know if I can say, but it's endless. You can,
Yeah.
life, it's complexity.
Right. So it starts simple, but you can add more. And if we wanted a more detailed model, we might add more and different feedback loops. Like if the fish, we could have the available food supply, or we could have the temperature of the water. These could be represented as. So you've talked about stocks and flow are the structure. The feedback loops is what exists between the structure that determines the dynamics. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's this
Okay.
link between these elements that generates that behavior, and we call them the feedback loops.
Great. So let's jump into the model.
Okay.
We have some questions. I've got some questions here, but if you have any questions on this simulation, post them here and I can ask them, because we're now live. I assume we're live. We're live in the simulation, right? We're doing it live.
It's live.
Yeah, so if you guys see something that breaks, we're doing it live. Okay.
And we'll do the editing later.
Yeah, explain what's going on here, what people are seeing then.
Yeah, so this is the exact same model that I showed you on the slides, with this susceptible population, the infectious, and the removed population. And you see as I hover over the boxes, you see these numbers. So this is a live model that I'm going to demonstrate to you, to show you. What I did not show there is that what drives the infection rate is basically these 3 parameters. The contact rate is this, the people that you meet every day, and how many people that you meet and you potentially could infect, and the total population, and also the infectivity, which is a property of that virus or whatever is causing the infection. So and the other thing that I did not show is the time for the illness before it's either the infectious population either die or they recover.
Okay.
And we are assuming a limited population. So I can run this model, and you can see what's happening there. You see that we started the.
Oh, you're clicking it. What's happening? Are you advancing it a little?
I'm advancing this in time, just because I did it this way, so that also the people see these graphs as they're generated. But yeah, this is the behavior that we have seen previously on that screen. I just wanted to show you that it can be generated live like this, and it can be controlled. And you can see that the susceptible population was declining as the infectious population was increasing, and we reached the peak when the negative feedback loop becomes dominant, and then the removal of cases will reduce that curve again. Any questions?
We often hear about R OT values or R OT something. Is that reflected in this model anywhere?
Yes, actually the R is a computed value, and I do have a structure to represent this, which is the R naught and the R. We call it the base reproduction rate and the reproduction R. And what it is the base reproduction rate is composed of the contact rate, which I talked about, the infectivity of the virus, and also the average duration of the illness. And so these are the numbers that make up that value. And if we multiply it by the susceptible population and divide it by the total population, we get the reproduction rate, which is
so this shows how those not only is it a simulation, but it shows kind of how these numbers are put together. Like how when people are just claiming R not this or R value this shows how you go about getting those numbers, because the simulation structure is kind of replicates it.
Exactly. And you can see that very interestingly, what we can control and what we cannot control as well.
What do you mean by that? Go a little deeper on that.
So if I look at, let's talk about the reproduction rate. Infectivity, that's a property of the virus. I don't know. I mean, this is people like in their data, they look for each virus and they have their means to calculate this. but I can't intervene and change the infectivity of a virus.
Mm-hmm.
The average duration of illness, that's how long it takes for somebody to recover or maybe die or so. This value is actually generated as the pandemic develops.
Mm-hmm.
However, the contact rate, the probability that you go and meet with others in a confined space, etc. These values we know from the interaction. What is typical if you go to school? What is typical if you go to a restaurant? What is it if you're in long-term care facility? And that's what makes most of these policies to intervene, is to try to control the contact rate. We all heard about flattening the curve,
Right.
I believe, and I also demonstrated that. Flattening the curve is basically trying to reduce the contact rate so that the peak doesn't get quickly and also doesn't get high as well. If I, for example, try to reduce the contact rate, which I'm attempting to do here by reducing the value of the contact rate, as you can see, I'm reducing the peak, and I'm also delaying when it happens. So if I'm not ready to have the capacity in hospitals to take care of all, I need to delay this until I build that capacity. And I also don't want to have a high peak of cases that will overwhelm the system. So control of contact rate through lockdowns, through masks, etc. This is limiting how people.
Now this model takes everything into contact rate, but could you model contact rate by social distancing, contact rate by mask usage? Could you add those details to the simulation if you wanted to create a sort of, okay, so
exactly.
This can get more detailed very fast.
Yeah, you can disaggregate this value. Now I'm just using a value that I'm changing, but if, as I showed here, this value, for example, is composed of several interventions. I mean, I'm just saying it as an example, but it's not the same. But this is, I'm using it as a parameter that I deal with, but it could, it's an aggregation of multiple interventions.
But another important thing is that all interventions basically deal with contact rate right now at this stage of the pandemic. There are variations of this entire model. This is the one thing we get to control right now for the most part.
Exactly, especially when we talk about, hey, I'm limiting the infusion of cases coming from a different country, from a different town.
Well, so that was a question that Ms. Falkenberry asked, that we may in the live model see if you can do something where we add new cases coming in later on from a different country or something like that. She was asking, can this model represent new cases coming in from outside the area? And I thought when we get into when we're playing around with it, maybe we can try that one as well.
Yeah, we definitely can do. Definitely.
Okay. So let's talk about, so this is great. It's good information. I know about the pandemic. I'm a business leader. I'm a state healthcare official. I'm a government federal official. What am I looking at for pandemic responses, right? How do I use this model to sort of look at what a pandemic response would be? Or I'm a consumer of information and I want to know, can this model replicate what we've seen? It's very simple. It's very limited. It's got not much information, but can it actually give us insights into what we've already seen or experienced?
Yes, sure, definitely. And I think for policymakers or even somebody who is around this phenomena is to probably see how important it is the timing is important in trying to design policies or react to something that is.
What do you mean by timing?
Okay, I'll demonstrate that.
Okay.
Timing is when to intervene, when to reduce contact rate, when to do a lockdown, etc. And we can do that practically here on screen.
So what are we looking at? Walk us through what's here on screen.
Yeah, so I took you from the model itself to a simple interface where I will just change the contact rate, because that's the only thing I can do right now is to change the contact rate. So I'll clean it up, and then I'll start a case with we do have a contact rate of 2, and then I progress in time every 5 days. There are cases, they're so small that they don't show up. You know, in day, let's see, what is it? Day 20, the cases become like 2,000, and I'm reporting 1,400 cases per day.
Right.
This is an alarm. If I did not act in day 10, I'm acting now in day 20, and I decide to do probably a partial lockdown or stop schools, etc. Basically, what I'm trying to control is to reduce the contact rate to a very small value.
So let's put this in real terms. This is March, right? It's been we've first cases showed up in the U.S. in February. They were in Washington. In March, we see a few cases in San Francisco, New York. All of a sudden, it starts accelerating, and everything shuts down. I think everyone remembers that week. The basketball shut down. The president went on TV with the White House for declared a national emergency. The travel was shut down. Festivals got canceled. All work started. It felt like in a week, everything began shutting down. That's what you're talking about here. Is so we're now mid to late March. Okay, walk me through what happens then.
Yeah, we reacted, or the reaction was when the cases started to be like in 1,000 or so. It's tricky. If you are in day 10, you see, you probably have 20 cases.
Where are you looking at so that the people watching, it's at the bottom of this chart, the numbers are adjusting?
Yes, if you at the bottom of the chart, you see days, and it says, you see where I'm pointing today.
Yep.
Yeah, so if I click here on, you see this cursor moving, the numbers are changing next to the days. This is 16 days, for example, and you see in the red stripe below, it's 146 cases.
Yep.
If I go to day 20, they're 2,000.
Wow.
10 days. So now I started a lockdown, as you mentioned. Now I'd like to see what's going to happen. So you can see the cases reported per day, and because this is theoretical, we are thinking, hey, if we do this, everybody will respond at the same time. And
very theoretical that everyone will respond in the same time in the same way.
Excuse us, this is not what happens in reality, but that's what a simple model is showing.
Yep.
But just the merit of the message is just this reduction. And although that this reduction goes down quickly, you know, the number of cases is still coming because still infection happening. But, you know, I mean, we could see that, hey, we did this decision. Now we went down from 400 cases to, from 1,200 to 400. That's almost a third. And as we continue, this is dropping, and we think, yeah, you know what? We reduced the numbers, the daily numbers by to the third. Why don't we try to open up and see? And maybe people, you know, spend some time, and if we open up, they start hugging each other and going.
So we're now looking in April when some of the states were like, let's relax the social distancing and lockdowns. We think we're pretty okay. We haven't seen a lot of cases. Sort of April and May, we begin seeing the relaxing or the desire to relax.
Yes, so that's why I increased the contact rate even before higher than the base, which was 2 when everybody was doing their own. And now they come out of lockdown, they want to rush at each other, etc. And this is what happens. You just get that peak because of this change from very low value, below 1, to around 2.9 or so. And then you get this second increase in number of cases. And of course, it will decline because you're basically draining the population. And this is a perfect, I would not say a perfect, this is ideal state when you are assuming that the population is all the same and they're not increasing, right. Nobody's coming.
But that looks like a lot of the US pattern you showed earlier, where it's a small peak followed by a much larger peak after a period of time.
And it will take some time, and it will decline. So you will see that growth and then stabilization is not, and then that's plateauing. People think, oh, we plateaued it. We're reaching the goal, but then eventually it will go up again, only also to decline after some time. because we just can't grow forever, as we discussed. And that's a behavior that we can see happening until, oops, sorry.
Yep.
Okay, so that's, oh, did I start it from the beginning? Yeah, we can.
Yeah, if you can quickly jump that up, and then, so go ahead and put that back on the screen, and then show us if there, can you overlay something different on that to show a different?
Oh, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. So here we are, we're going, it's mid-March, we implement a lockdown, our contact rate drops dramatically, we start advancing for there, and again, these times are relative, I'm using things, but now we're into mid-April, May, we feel better, the states start reopening, they're all open by May, and all of a sudden we have this second peak at a very high level. That looks a lot like the US pattern, but what, can this produce other patterns as well?
Yeah.
So can you overlay something on top of that?
Yes. So, for example, if something is starting with they intervene very quickly and they reduce the contact rate
early.
Got
it.
Or it happens that they are in a place where the contact is not high that much. But let's start from the same base and just go. We should have, yeah. We should have it. If I stop it, it will come back.
Okay.
I think what we're looking at is we need to see different trends overlap with each other. So that's, I'm trying to do that, and then you kind of reduce this early on, and you just see
wow,
that.
so it's much lower.
Yes, you see it in the bottom chart, this magenta line. Mm-hmm. You see it, it peaks later. It is slow, but it doesn't mean, I mean, that that things will continue like this. Maybe somebody will again bring this up and relax, and then you have a peak.
A late peak rather than an early peak.
A late peak or an early peak. But if you keep it down, it will continue. So that's another way of showing of how different peaks manifest.
Can you so I actually grabbed a few behavior modes from countries. Can you release the share real quick?
Oh, yes.
So what he just talked about with those different behavior modes, back before the show started, we put this in the oven. No, it's sort of like one of those things in a cooking show where you got the one demonstration that you already have. I actually went out and grabbed some country modes to show this effect that he's talking about, some of these different ones. So we start with, this is kind of what he was showing. You have here a variety of waves. You have a double peak wave, where you have an initial peak in the dark blue. And again, just to clear the chart, people per day, time, you have an initial, it drops, declines slightly, then rises again. And it's very odd behavior. And people said, well, is that realistic? Is that how it actually looks like? Then there's a much more traditional growth and collapse here in the magenta, and then a flatten the curve. Well, I went out and pulled some country models to show these behaviors from the charts. And so we look at Gutter. Gutter, right, has the traditional rise and collapse. It's got 120,000 cases in total. And the way where I got these charts, they're always scaling the volume for the population. So they're all going to be about the same size. But look really at the shape of the curve. This is a classic growth and collapse mode. So it represents this magenta line. But then you've got the Netherlands here has this much more sharp rise followed by drop, a little bit of a plateau followed by a second sharp rise. That's the dark blue. That really happens. You can go out and look and find these patterns. It looks weird, but it's actually happening. Now, of course, in reality, the lines are a little more jagged. Things are happening. It's not as clean, but the general shape is still there. Then this one on the right, it's a little tricky to see with Vietnam, but Vietnam's cases are so low that even though it looks like a big increase when it's by itself, if you plotted Vietnam with these other, if you plotted all these together with 120,000 cases, 80,000 cases, and here's Vietnam with its, 1,000 cases, it would look like this late delay, very slight peak. Yes, it has a peak, but it's a much flatter peak. And then, of course, the US is a fourth type of behavior mode that actually Rafat showed on his live demo, which is it goes up to an early peak, declines, and then rises to a second, even higher peak following. Now, the trick with these country modes compared to Rafat's model, I think, was only 10,000 people. It's perfect mixing. These countries represent different regions, different reservoirs, different state policies, millions and millions of people. So you get a lot more complex patterns, but it's still following the same basic dynamics as what the simple model shows, which I think is the power of these simple models. And speaking of the simple models, we've had some questions, Rafat. If you're willing to, I know this is like a live wire act. Some people have asked if we can add some stuff to the model. Are you able to add some simple things to this model? I only want to do one or two, but there's been some questions in the comments like, could you try this? So are you willing to add some stuff to the simulation?
Like what?
Well, the first one, so Miss Falkenberry asked, one of the very first questions she asked was whether, and this gets into, she asked whether removed population can loop back into susceptible. And I think what this gets into is this question of antibody T immunity cell resistance. What happens if we don't get that herd immunity? If herd immunity is, say, a short duration, let's say herd immunity, not herd immunity, your antibody and your T cells only give you immunity for 6 months. That would imply that people who recover go back into the susceptible. Can you show that on, are you able to model that, like to take a look at what that might look like?
Yeah, we can do that if you.
Yeah, why don't you pull up?
Sure, I can pull up.
So now we're doing a really live TV, adjusting a simulation model live TV. This is always, they advise you not to do this. So if this goes horribly wrong, we'll edit this whole part out.
This is a modeling reality show.
Yeah, exactly. Modeling reality. America's Got Models. That actually sounds like a reality show now.
Yeah. So let me share my screen, and if you don't, just a second. I'm just having.
Zoom can hide the windows on you if you got too many windows going.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that I am in the right screen. So let me share. So do you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So what we mean by people who are recovered or so, that they lose their immunity or so, is that simply they become susceptible again.
Right. So here's the scenario. I think if I'm understanding Ms. Falkenberry correct, you get infected. You're someone like me. I've been infected. I've gone to the hospital. I recovered. I wasn't removed. I was removed, but not permanently, fortunately. We'll get into the brain functioning later. Hopefully my brain functioning is still good. But now I've got a question. Like let's say it's only good for 6 months. This is a hypothetical. We don't know for sure. It's new research. But what happens if my immunity, even though I've recovered, only lasts for 6 months? How does that change the dynamics of this over time? Because I'm going to become susceptible again. How does that work?
So we can connect the removed or recovered.
So what you're doing now, let me walk through while you do it. You're taking a flow. So we talk about these structure components, and a flow is one of the two, the stocks and the flow. And you're basically like now saying, look, there were a series of tubs. There was susceptible, infectious, and removed, and each one drains the other. Now the bottom tub has a pipe that goes back up to the first tub and drains into it. And that's what you're creating here. So this is immunity loss. Okay.
Yes. So I created this pipe. And I call it here, the flow is immunity loss.
Okay.
And
she said 6 months as can you do 6 month time to lose? Oh, good.
Time to lose immunity. And we just gonna go ahead and, because I run the model in days, so 6 months will be 180 days if my math is right. Mm-hmm. And the units is days here. And then I am draining this population. So I need to connect this. This means this population is drained, and I need to connect the time to lose.
So these connectors are basically symbols for there's a mathematical, this is going to become a mathematical piece of this formula. It's pulling in this data to do them. Oh, and you're doing the math here.
The rate will be the removed population divided the time, because what do we say by rate is how many people over a period of time will lose their immunity and join the susceptible population.
So if we had 10,000 people and removed, and it's 180 days to lose immunity, you're basically saying at the end of 180 days after the last person in is removed, they should be back in susceptible, except this is going to flow continuously.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
So we created the plumbing, as I like to call it, and we do have a time scale of 60 days, but this is, I mean, if we run the model, we will not see anything, and I can prove that, and just run it. Maybe I need to put it in a quick run mode. I don't need to go step by step, and I did have a stop time of 60 days. I'll make it maybe 365.
Okay, so now we're looking at a year. Got it.
And for the add it, then let's try that.
Let's run it and see what happens. All right. So wow, that's interesting. So walk us through what we're seeing here.
So here we've had this. I mean, ignore the rest of the chart. This is what we have seen before: the rise and the decline of infectious population, and also the decline of the susceptibles. However, they did not go to zero, because as time goes by, there's something flowing back and into the susceptible. And despite that, this is going down over time because they're growing. The susceptibles are growing. At some point, the infection will start, and then they will also decline. So you'll see this dance between the susceptible and the infectious.
This is really the hammer and the dance. This is the dance part where there's going to be a trade-off back and forth now, because the model, people flow back into infected, they get sick again, they flow back and forth.
Yes, so this stock is never drained to zero.
Mm-hmm.
And if, for example, because we open borders, etc., and there are cases coming in, if they increase this number, this will reinforce the contagious loop.
So because that was Ms. Falkenberry's second question, is so in this one right now, we do have a scenario where they're coming in from outside, or and it could be outside our neighborhood, outside our state, outside of our whatever we're modeling. There are people that weren't originally in the model now coming in at a later point in time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
I do have this in the model, because I extended the because lockdown cannot continue forever. So
Right.
it was part of the model to assume that after like 6 months, 8 months, there is another
Inflow of people, new people.
inflow of people. I mean, if there is perfect immunity, this might not have an impact. But if there is susceptible, so the fire has wood that can continue to burn, then with adding people coming and we're losing immunity, this could come again.
So this now shows a double wave pattern, wave 1 and wave 2. We don't have, so earlier people were asking about genetic mutations and modifications. This is showing that even before any mutations, it's the same virus. If we lose immunity, there is a dynamic of reinfection that itself would generate wave 2, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And I'm not an expert on immunity or T cells or things like that, but this is just showing it doesn't take a mutation to have a wave 2. If there's as long as there's someone out there who's still infected in a reservoir who can reinfect people, and as long as once we have it, we don't gain permanent immunity, it fades over time, there's going to be a risk of these reoccurring wave patterns.
Yes, and as we said, this is assuming that there are cases coming. This is assuming perfect mixing. So, I mean, it's not to scare anybody, but it's a phenomena that the dynamics is there to recreate this. It doesn't mean it has to happen, but it is possible.
And that's a very dynamic behavior you have down there now. From where we started with simple curves and going one way, we've got a very interesting behavior model.
Yeah, and I mean, this is also with the contact rate, which is I guess low, but we can also change it. But it's just to demonstrate that the question that Falcon asked, that how do we model this? It's just a simple flow from here to there.
Excellent. Well,
I hope that answers the question.
I think it did. And, if there's any more questions, put them on the comments. We'll check. But Rafat, while we're waiting for those, thank you very much for coming. This was incredibly educational. I mean, you were able to go through the initial dynamic behavior, how we're getting all these charts. You walked us through, what is the system structure of the pandemic? What does it look like? Then you broke down, like, what are that system structure of stocks and flows? That's just the pieces of it, but how they're connected in the feedback loops, that's how it creates the dynamics. We did the simulation, which I really appreciated being able to see it live. And I think it was kind of fun to go through those pandemic responses, not fun to live through, but fun to see in a simulation. And then you took a risk. I appreciate that. You actually modified the model based off a question and showed that these structural elements can be added or removed. And that's a modeling decision, what you include or what you don't, how long you have. But I want to thank you again for your time and appreciate it. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. And I hope you've enjoyed this. We may have Rafat on again for something he's actually, some of the expertise he has in organizations and business, but I know everyone's right now thinking COVID. So I wanted to use this opportunity to introduce this using a COVID-19 example. So any final words, Rafat?
Thank you very much, Tim, for having me, and thanks to the audience who came and asked very, very good questions that allowed us to explore the dynamic behavior and also show the power of simple models in exploring and improving understanding. And also thanks to those who developed those models to begin with. As we are using them and make them accessible to people, despite that, what I hear about that models are wrong, etc., it is how we consume models that matter most. I think what are the limitations? Where is the model good, and where is it goes outside its limits? But they are very good tools to help us understand complex phenomena that goes around us.
If someone wanted to play with this model, is it available online that they could go in and move it around themselves?
Yes, it's available online. There is a link in the slides, but we can, I think you can add it to the YouTube description.
Yep. So if you're watching on YouTube in the future, look down below, you'll find a link to the model, and we'll also have a link to Rafat's LinkedIn so you can follow him there. Well, Rafat, thank you very much. This is Timothy Clancy with Dialectic Simulations. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll do this again in the future with different topics, and hopefully this was informative. Everyone, take care. Bye-bye. Appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.